My dad pointed at me in front of a packed courtroom, his finger cutting through the air like a verdict. "This boy only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve." That's what he said right in front of the judge, who just happened to be his old friend. The judge nodded slow and smug, while my dad's lawyer leaned back with that smile people wear when they think the game is already fixed. They all thought I was cornered, the worthless son, the broken kid they could silence and strip clean. They didn't know I'd spent my whole life preparing for this moment, carrying wounds they never thought I'd survive. So when I finally opened my mouth, I said 2 words. Just 2 that wiped the color off every face in that room. My name is Aldrich Vance. And before I share my story with you, I want to know you're here with me. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you are. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes the truth easier to carry. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you want to follow stories like mine, stories about betrayal, justice, and finding your own strength, I'd love for you to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. It helps more than you know. My name is Aldrich Vance, and on the day I turned 30, I found myself sitting at the defendant's table inside the Denver Supreme Court, staring at the man who helped bring me into this world and spent the rest of his life pretending I didn't exist. The room smelled like cold paper and disinfectant, the kind of smell that clings to walls built for judgment. White lights burned overhead, bright enough to show every twitch of a mouth, every shift in posture. The reporters sat at the back pens, ready, while a few strangers watched like they'd stumbled into a matinee they never expected to enjoy. I sat beside my attorney, hands cold but steady, and I realized my heartbeat wasn't panicking, it was pacing itself like it knew I'd replayed this scene in my head too many times to count. Across from me was Senator Griffin Vance, my father by biology, and almost nothing else, leaning forward with the stiff posture of a man who believed the world owed him control. Next to him sat his lawyer, Martin Dryden, flipping through papers like the verdict had already been printed. And above them all was Judge Terrence Mallory, the one man in the room who was supposed to be neutral, but whose eyes kept drifting toward my father with a familiarity no courtroom should allow. Then Griffin stood, pointed straight at me, and let his voice cut the air. "This boy only knows how to waste what he doesn't deserve. He doesn't understand the value of anything in this family." He spoke with the tone he used on televised hearings, calm, authoritative. Measured like this was just another committee he intended to dominate. Mallory gave a small nod, the kind someone gives when they've already agreed to a conclusion before hearing the facts. Dryden smiled, the thin smile of a man watching a trap, close exactly as planned. So I spoke up, not loudly, just enough for the room to hear, and explained that my grandfather, Elias Rowan, had left everything to me in a will signed, witnessed, and backed by medical certification proving he was fully lucid. I said it plainly, without apology. The Rowan estate, the industries, the land, the investments, they were mine because he wanted them to be. My father was only here to overturn it, claiming I was mentally unstable, inexperienced, and unduly influenced after the deaths of the 2 people who actually raised me. I watched the words land on the judge's face like he'd heard them in rehearsal. I watched the corners of Griffin's mouth lift, as if he believed saying something enough times made it true. I looked at my father then, and remembered all the times he'd appeared on television, smiling into the camera, talking about family values and responsibility to our children. I remembered birthdays he never showed up to, school plays where he was a blank space on an empty chair, holidays where his absence was wrapped up and handed to me like another silent gift. And it hit me not with pain anymore, but with clarity, that the man pointing at me today wasn't the disappointment of a child, but the political opponent of an adult. He was a man defending his image, not confronting his son. There was a time I would have begged for him to see me, to call me his boy, to choose me even once. That time was gone. I didn't need his affection. I needed the truth to stand, and for him to stop taking whatever he wanted simply because he carried the Vance name. I glanced toward Judge Mallory again. I'd seen his face before, not here, but in old photos hanging in my grandfather's study. Photos from fundraisers, charity dinners, private events where Mallory stood shoulder to shoulder with my father. These weren't coincidences. They were patterns. And patterns always lead somewhere if you follow them long enough. I leaned down slightly, letting my hand brush the leather case resting by my feet. Inside was the file I'd spent weeks assembling, the file my grandfather had unknowingly helped me build long before he died. It was heavy, not just with paper, but with the weight of what it represented. They thought they were walking into a performance. They thought I was the powerless son, the grieving boy, the easy target. They had no idea the part I came here to play, and they certainly didn't know that 2 words from me would make the entire courtroom go quiet. But to explain how I got to that moment, I have to go back to the house that raised me and to the man who didn't. I grew up in a stone house tucked beneath the Aspen Ridge Mountains, where the air always smelled like pine, and the floors always creaked in familiar ways. Rowan Estate wasn't just a home, it was a sanctuary built from the pieces of 2 people who loved me enough to fill every missing corner my father left behind. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floors of my grandmother Helena's art room, warming the paint-splattered tables and the canvases she never quite finished. My earliest memories are of her hands guiding mine across watercolor paper, while my grandfather Elias stood in the doorway pretending not to smile. I called them Grandpa Elias and Grandma Helena before I could spell my own name. The word Dad, on the other hand, meant nothing. It was an empty definition, a placeholder for someone who existed only on the other side of a television screen. And even though I didn't understand politics, I understood absence. The estate held it in the walls the way old houses hold secrets. Holidays were the clearest proof of that. Every Christmas morning, Grandma Helena kept her phone within reach, pretending she was checking recipes or timers. But I saw her eyes flick toward the screen whenever it buzzed, hoping for a call from Griffin that never came. Grandpa Elias, sensing the heaviness, always rushed in with an extra gift or a story about the first snowstorms he survived as a kid. We made memories, real memories, but they were always shadowed by the empty chair at the table. The first time I consciously realized I didn't have a father was during a news broadcast. Griffin appeared on the screen, talking with passion about the importance of protecting our families. I asked my grandparents, "Does he ever think about me?" Grandpa Elias laid a gentle hand on my shoulder and talked about complicated grief and hard choices. His voice was steady, but something in his eyes cracked. And even at that age, I recognized the way adults bend the truth to protect a child's heart. Then came the night I walked past the study and heard my grandfather's voice raised something he almost never did. I stopped at the door and listened. Griffin was on speakerphone asking for campaign funding and implying that acknowledging me publicly could be part of the negotiation. "If you want me to look like a dedicated father on camera, you know what that requires," he said. My grandfather snapped back, "He's your son, not a prop." That was the moment the illusion died. My father didn't miss me because he was grieving. He ignored me because I wasn't useful. After that, I clung even more to the man who stepped into the role my father abandoned. Grandpa Elias took me to the factories of Rowan Industries, teaching me how machines worked, how workers deserved respect, how leadership wasn't about power but responsibility. In the plant, people called him Mr. Rowan, but to me, he was the only father figure I'd ever known. He went to every school conference, signed every permission slip as guardian, and cheered louder than anyone when I performed in our school's winter play. Grandma Helena carried her own quiet grief. Once I found her staring at a portrait of Griffin when he was younger, a soft, hopeful smile frozen in time. She lifted the frame from the wall, held it for a moment, then said, "Some pictures only make a room colder before putting it away." I didn't understand it then, but as the years passed, that line replayed itself in my mind, gaining meaning each time. By the time I was old enough to question things, the story that Griffin stayed away because he was too heartbroken to face me no longer made sense. I knew the truth lived somewhere deeper, somewhere uglier. And I promised myself that one day, if our paths crossed again, I wouldn't ask why he didn't love me. I would ask why he lied about it. But before I could confront him, I had to lose the 2 people who protected me from that truth. And when that happened, everything in my life shifted toward the moment I found myself in that courtroom, staring at the man who once existed only on a screen. I didn't stay in Aspen Ridge when I turned 18. I left for the East Coast, choosing a business and technology program in Boston because it felt like the farthest place from the shadow of my father and the closest step toward becoming someone my grandparents could be proud of. College was loud, competitive, and relentlessly fast, nothing like the quiet rhythm of Rowan Estate. But every break without fail, I went back home. I'd land in Denver, drive the familiar road up the mountain, And the moment I saw the stone house appear between the pines, a part of me settled. That was the only place in the world that had ever felt steady. I threw myself into school internships at tech firms late nights, studying group projects that tested my patience, partly because I wanted a future built by my own hands, and partly because I needed to prove, if only to myself, that I wasn't anything like the version of me Griffin had painted in the eyes of his political circle. A boy who would grow up to waste anything he touched. A boy who would never be enough. I never heard those words directly from him, but I'd heard the whispers through people loyal to him, and whispers wound deeper than shouts. When I came home after my sophomore year, I noticed Grandpa Elias forgetting small things, dates conversations where he'd put his keys. At first I brushed it off as age, but one morning he called me kiddo twice in a row like he was starting the same sentence over. I suggested we see a doctor. He agreed too quickly. That's how we ended up in a sterile examination room in Denver, listening to an oncologist speak in careful rehearsed phrases about tumors, treatment options, and limited time. I remember staring at the floor, counting the tiles just to anchor myself while the smell of disinfectant made it hard to breathe. He put a hand on my shoulder afterward and said he wasn't afraid of dying, only of leaving things unfinished. A week later, the family lawyer came to Rowan Estate with a stack of documents. We sat in the study while afternoon light filtered through the curtains, and my grandfather said without hesitation, "Everything will go to you." My heart hammered at the weight of that sentence. The company, the land, the assets, it was too much for someone my age. I told him I wasn't ready. He said readiness wasn't the point. You're the only one who sees this as more than a number on paper. I asked about my father, and he didn't dodge the question. He's had decades to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. He made his choice. And now, you must make yours. That conversation haunted me, but nothing prepared me for what happened a month later. I came home unexpectedly one afternoon and saw a black SUV parked at the gate. My father's SUV. I froze in the driveway, hidden behind a stand of trees, watching him walk into the house for the first time in more than 20 years. I didn't go inside. Instead, I stood outside the window of the study where I'd spent half my childhood and watched two silhouettes, my grandfather in his armchair. Griffin standing stiffly arguing with sharp gestures. No warmth, no grief, no reconciliation. Later, my grandfather stepped out looking exhausted, and my father drove away without glancing at me. It took me months and several files in my grandfather's desk to understand that meeting. Griffin had come to pressure him into creating a trust under his control, something he could use to access the estate indirectly. He called it protecting me. But protection wasn't what he wanted. He wanted a way in. My grandfather died on a cloudy morning in early spring. He held my hand and whispered the last words he would ever say to me. "Do not let fear of powerful men silence you." His grip loosened and then he was gone. I stayed by the bed long after the machines stopped, unable to imagine a world without him in it. After the funeral, Rowan Estate felt hollow. Every chair looked like it was waiting for him to sit in it. Every room smelled like the last season he lived through. Grandma Helena deteriorated quickly after that. She tried to paint again but couldn't finish a single piece. One night she simply didn't wake up. Losing her felt like losing the last soft place in the world. Days after her funeral, I went to the study just to feel close to them. While opening a drawer, I found a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's handwriting. Inside was a letter and a list of names, organizations, donors, familiar political figures. My father's name was there, and Judge Terrence Mallory's. Next to each name were short notes, conflicts, favor exchanges, campaign funding routes. At the bottom he'd written, "If he ever returns not as a father, but as a claimant, these names will guide you. Only use them if necessary. You'll know when that time comes." I sat there alone reading the letter over and over, feeling a cold certainty settle in my chest. The list wasn't just information, it was a warning. And a map. My grandfather had known this fight was coming. He just didn't know when. And I didn't know it would begin so soon, or that when it did, my father wouldn't come alone. He'd bring someone wearing a judge's robe. The first shot of the battle began with an envelope of his own, one far less loving than the one my grandfather left behind. After burying Grandma Helena, I returned to Rowan Estate exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix. The house was too quiet, every creak amplified by the wind threading through the pines outside. I barely made it to the front door when a courier approached with a thick envelope stamped with legal insignia. My name was typed neatly on the front. I didn't have to open it to know it was bad news. Still, I tore it open with numb fingers. The first line read, Plaintiff Griffin Vance, Defendant Aldrich Vance. My grief turned cold. The letter accused me of lacking the mental and emotional capacity to manage the estate. It claimed I was too traumatized to make rational decisions and had been improperly influenced by my grandparents. Every sentence was written to paint me as unstable. It was calculated not just to seize control of the estate, but to damage my credibility. Publicly convenient timing for someone in the middle of a re-election campaign. I called our family lawyer Marlene Crawford and met her the next day. She had handled contracts and disputes for my grandfather for years. When I handed her the complaint, she read it with the tight-lipped expression of someone who'd seen too many political games. There's something else, she said. The judge assigned to the case is Terrence Mallory. The room seemed to tilt. Mallory was one of the names on my grandfather's list. I told her about the envelope, the notes, the connections. She listened carefully and then said, If your grandfather wrote his name down, it wasn't random. This isn't just a lawsuit. This is alignment. I went home and compared the list with public records. There it was small but unmistakable. Campaign funding from one of Griffin's political committees funneled through an organization Mallory had ties to. Not illegal on its own, but enough to suggest a relationship no judge should have with a plaintiff. My grandfather must have seen this coming. A week later, I met Griffin for the first time in over 2 decades. He asked for a private conversation, so we met in a quiet tea house in downtown Denver. He arrived in a tailored suit and the kind of polished smile politicians practice in mirrors. He didn't hug me. He didn't ask how I was handling the funerals. He sat down and got straight to business. Let's avoid unnecessary conflict. You're young. You don't need the pressure of an empire on your shoulders. Transfer the estate to me voluntarily and I'll make sure you're taken care of. He didn't see me as a son. He saw me as an obstacle. I refused. He didn't get angry. He just shrugged and said, Then we'll settle this in court. That night I returned to the estate and opened every file my grandfather had left behind. I read his letter until the ink felt imprinted on my skin. I traced every line of the list, every connection, every hint. I searched through public databases until dawn. 3 different political donors connected my father and Mallory. 2 past rulings showed Mallory siding with allies of my father. And a financial disclosure form placed both men at the same private dinner hosted months before my grandfather died. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation my grandfather had tried to give me. I called a private investigator the next morning and asked him to dig into every interaction between Griffin and Mallory over the past 10 years. If they wanted to weaponize the legal system against me, I needed the truth. All of it. And the deeper the investigator looked, the clearer it became that this fight was about far more than my inheritance. It was about exposing what my grandfather had quietly guarded me from my entire life. I just didn't know yet how ugly the truth would be or how much it would cost to confront it. I met the private investigator in a narrow office wedged between an old bookstore and a coffee shop in Capitol Hill. The blinds were half closed, the carpet worn, and the faint smell of stale espresso drifted in from next door. It wasn't glamorous, but something about the simplicity of the place made me trust him more than any polished downtown firm. I laid the envelope on his desk, the one with the names my grandfather had left me, and explained everything from the lawsuit to the judge's suspicious familiarity with my father. He listened quietly, tapping a pen on his notepad, then asked what exactly I wanted him to find. I told him the only truth that mattered. Anything that proves Mallory has no business presiding over my case. A week later, he sent his preliminary report. 4 fundraising events linked Mallory and Griffin. 2 trips where Mallory and his wife traveled with a group of donors tied to my father, and a non-profit sponsored by Mallory had received a large anonymous donation. On the same day, one of Griffin's committees made a significant contribution. The pattern was undeniable. I felt anger press against my ribs, but beneath it was something colder, a sense that none of this was accidental. Then came the photo. A grainy image from 10 years ago taken at a corporate gala. My grandfather stood facing Mallory, the two locked in what looked like a tense conversation. I stared at it for a long time. It was the first time I had ever seen them in the same frame, and it suggested a history I hadn't known existed. If my grandfather distrusted Mallory long before this lawsuit, why hadn't he told me directly? Why leave clues instead of truths? The questions pushed me back into the Rowan Industries archives. In a storage room beneath the main office, I found boxes of old legal filings, business disputes, and letters my grandfather had exchanged with attorneys. Buried under faded folders was a document that made my stomach knot, a legal brief from years ago involving a company partially owned by Mallory before he became a judge. There was also a letter from my grandfather to his attorney warning of ethical vulnerabilities within the local judicial system. His handwriting was sharp and angry, an unusual tone for him. It was clear he'd known exactly who Mallory was long before my father tried to use him. But the most damning discovery came from our own security system. Aspen Crest, the hotel chain my grandfather owned, kept years of archived camera footage. When I searched for Griffin's stays at the property, one clip stood out, a recording from a VIP lounge showing Griffin and Mallory entering through a side door, speaking quietly, then disappearing into a private suite. The footage was time-stamped 3 months before my grandfather died. I replayed it again and again, feeling something inside me shift. The timing, the secrecy, the tension my grandfather had carried after his meeting with Griffin, it all tangled into a knot I couldn't ignore. For the first time, I wondered if my grandfather's final decline had been purely medical. I wasn't ready to believe otherwise, but the thought sat in the back of my mind like a shadow expanding across a wall. I remembered the day he returned from seeing my father, how his hands trembled, how he'd struggled to stand. I had blamed the cancer then. Now I wasn't so sure. But speculation wouldn't win in court. Facts would. So I organized everything: the photos, the documents, the financial trails, the footage, and built a timeline that revealed the quiet, calculated relationship between Griffin and Mallory. Every detail made the situation clearer and uglier. I convinced myself that when the first hearing arrived, I'd be ready. I thought evidence alone would be enough to level the playing field. I didn't realize the courtroom I was about to walk into had been staged long before I ever stepped inside. I told myself I had prepared for war. But the truth was, I had only reached the edge of the battlefield. The first day of the hearing felt colder than it had any right to. The hallways of the Denver Supreme Court echoed with footsteps, camera shutters, and the low hum of reporters whispering my father's name. Every time I passed, a cluster of journalists' microphones tilted in my direction, but I kept my gaze on the doors ahead. Even surrounded by noise, I felt alone, like the only still object in a room that kept shifting. Inside the courtroom, Griffin performed with the same precision he used on the Senate floor. He rose, placed a hand over his heart, and spoke about losing my mother in childbirth, about the pain of watching his son struggle emotionally after the deaths of my grandparents. He said he feared the estate would overwhelm me, that he wanted to prevent me from making regrettable decisions during a vulnerable period. It was a masterclass in political empathy. People in the room nodded, even a few reporters softened. Then he called a woman I had never seen before. She introduced herself as a longtime family friend and said she had witnessed me in states of emotional volatility, moments she described with theatrical pauses and trembling hands. She claimed I had shouted at staff, threatened to isolate myself, made dangerous decisions. None of it was true. Not one word. But Mallory sat still and watched her like every sentence was gospel. My chest tightened. There's a specific kind of hurt that comes from being lied about, while the person who abandoned you profits from the lie. Every time my attorney objected, hearsay, lack of foundation, irrelevance, Mallory shut her down mid-sentence. When Dryden made a point, even a flimsy one, Mallory nodded as though he'd been waiting for the argument. Their rhythm was too smooth to be natural. Griffin would glance at the judge, and Mallory would respond with the smallest shift of expression. It was a language of familiarity, shaped long before this case existed. Then my father did something I didn't expect. He questioned my grandfather's mental state in his final months. He claimed the cancer treatments clouded his judgment, that grief had made him irrational, that I had been in his ear, influencing him far beyond healthy boundaries. Hearing him speak about the man who raised me with that kind of disrespect was the closest I came to losing my composure. But I remembered what my lawyer told me and what my grandfather wrote. Powerful men rely on intimidation to make others react. If I reacted, they would twist it into proof of instability. So I sat still, breathing evenly, hands clasped under the table. My attorney whispered, asking if I wanted to respond, but I shook my head. Let me handle it when it's my turn. My voice was low but steady. I wasn't going to give them the outburst they were praying for. When the time came for me to take the stand, I looked down at the leather case beside my chair. Inside it was everything they didn't know. I had the file my grandfather prepared, the evidence I gathered, the truths they believed no one would ever uncover. The courtroom felt hostile, tilted, designed to make me fail. But as I stood and placed my hand on the oath, I heard my grandfather's words again. Do not let fear of powerful men silence you. The stage they built was flawless, but they still didn't know what I had brought with me. When they finally called my name, I stood and walked toward the witness stand, aware of every pair of eyes tracking me. The air felt heavy, thick with expectation, and yet I felt strangely steady. Griffin leaned back in his chair like he was watching the final act of a play he'd written, a smile barely tugging at his mouth. Judge Mallory straightened, pen in hand, pretending to take notes, though he had barely written a word all morning. I knew this was the moment they believed would solidify everything. They expected me to crumble under pressure, to slip to make their narrative easier. But I didn't start by defending myself. I began with the one thing they didn't expect: the principle of judicial fairness. I spoke calmly about the duty of the court to uphold impartiality and the public's right to a fair verdict. The room shifted. People glanced at one another, unsure why I was talking about ethics instead of responding to accusations. Then I reached down, opened my leather case, and pulled out the first photograph. I held it up so that even the reporters in the back could see. This, I said, was taken at a fundraising event in 2018. I stated the date, the location, the list of sponsors, many of whom were tied directly to my father. Then I placed the next photo on the stand, showing Griffin and Mallory seated together at a charity gala in 2020. Finally, I revealed the one image I knew would shift the energy of the entire courtroom, the two of them in a private VIP lounge at Aspen Crest, heads bent close, speaking with the familiarity of old allies. I could hear soft murmurs spreading like ripples across water. My father's smile vanished. Mallory's hand twitched and he adjusted his glasses even though they hadn't slipped. "Mr. Vance, this is irrelevant," he began. I cut in cleanly. "It is directly relevant to the integrity of this hearing, Your Honor." His jaw tightened. I laid out the financial records, next the ones from my grandfather's letter. Donations routed through organizations Mallory publicly supported, matching the same dates as my father's campaign contributions. There were signatures, real ones, verifiable. I saw Dryden's face drain of color as he reached for his water glass. Then I brought out the final piece. "This," I said, sliding a flash drive toward the clerk, "is a segment of video recorded at Aspen Crest." A monitor was brought forward, and the courtroom watched as Mallory and Griffin entered a private room together 3 months before my grandfather died and days after he finalized the first draft of his will. The silence was absolute. Even the reporters had stopped typing. I turned back to Mallory. "The term for this is judicial misconduct," I said, letting the phrase land slowly and precisely. "And if any ruling in this courtroom reflects bias, this entire file will go straight to the Federal Ethics Committee." The pen fell from his hand. His face turned a shade lighter. Griffin leaned forward, no longer, relaxed his expression hard and frantic. Mallory swallowed, cleared his throat, and in the most unsteady voice I had heard from him all day, said the only judgment he could safely give. He declared the will valid, acknowledged my grandfather's competence, dismissed the lawsuit, and ended the hearing abruptly, as if fleeing a burning building. I looked at my father as he stood frozen in place, his eyes burning with disbelief. He had not been defeated by argument or strategy. He had been demolished by the truth he thought I would never uncover. And as I stood there absorbing the finality of it, I realized something simple and sharp: the collapse of his story had nothing to do with my strength. It collapsed because the truth outweighed every lie he had ever built. After the gavel struck and Mallory practically bolted from the bench, I remained in the courtroom standing beside the witness stand. Reporters rushed out like a tide, retreating phones pressed against their ears, eager to break the story before anyone else. My chest felt hot, my hands warm, but my mind was painfully clear. I sensed something unfinished, something personal. My lawyer placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "Aldrich, don't leave yet. He's coming." I didn't have to ask who. Griffin rose slowly, the practiced confidence stripped away. Without the courtroom facade, he looked smaller, like someone carrying the collapse of an entire world on his back. He took a few steps toward me, each one heavier than the last. His eyes weren't sad or apologetic. They were bruised by humiliation, by a kind of injury that sits in the ego, not the heart. He stopped a few feet away. For the first time, we were standing face to face, without cameras or public roles to hide behind. He spoke quietly. "You destroyed my entire career." The word "my" echoed in my mind. He still believed everything revolved around him. Even now, the word "dad" felt foreign on my tongue, if I had ever planned to use it. "You don't understand how vicious politics is," he said. "You should have let this play out the right way." The right way. In his version, that meant staying silent while he took something that never belonged to him. I met his gaze and finally said the truth I'd held on to for years. I didn't destroy anything. You did. Not because of me, but because you chose ambition over family long before today. He stared at me, his jaw clenched. I continued. Grandpa didn't leave me everything because he hated you. He left it because he trusted me not to turn it into a tool. You've never understood that. Not once. Saying it out loud felt like releasing a weight I'd carried since childhood. I wasn't trying to hurt him. I was finally done trying to be hurt by him. He leaned in slightly and said in a low voice, "Only I could hear. You don't know everything about me." Elias wasn't the hero you think he was. My heart lurched, not because I believed him, but because this was his final tactic: doubt, confusion, emotional sabotage. He wanted to destabilize me, to pull me back into the role of the lost child craving answers. But I didn't fall for it. I spoke evenly. I don't need to know everything about him to know who I am, and nothing you say will make me doubt the life he gave me. Something in his expression shifted. Not regret, resentment. The realization that the version of me he had counted on, timid, unsure, desperate, no longer existed. He turned away without another word, walking out with the stiff posture of someone refusing to acknowledge defeat, even as it pressed down on him. People watched him leave the courtroom in silence, the way you watch a monument crack down the middle. I remained standing, feeling the weight of years lift. It wasn't victory that filled my chest. It was a quiet peace. I hadn't won because he lost. I'd won because I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I stepped outside the courtroom and breathed in the cold Denver air. The case was over, but I knew my real life, my own life, was just beginning. The responsibility my grandfather left me wasn't a burden. It was a foundation. And for the first time, I felt ready to build on it.